A KXAN investigation found the federal government's use of immigration enforcement law focuses far more on migrants than the bosses who hire and pay them. This week, on Inside the Investigation, senior investigative producer David Barrere and investigative reporter Matt Grant explain how mass deportations impact the workforce and how law enforcement is increasingly partnering with the federal government to enforce immigration laws through what they call 287G agreements. Welcome to Inside the Investigation. Today, I am first joined by KXAN senior investigative producer David Barrere. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, David, you've been looking into these agreements between Immigration and Customs Enforcement and sheriff departments. They're called 287G agreements. But before we get too far into the conversation, tell us what they are.
Yeah, so they can actually be with more than just a sheriff's office. They can be with a state agency or local police department. But they're called 287G agreements because that is the section of federal legal code that created them in 1996. And they essentially allow local law enforcement to assume the duties of federal immigration police or federal immigration officers and carry out some of those duties. I'll go through, there's three types of agreements that do a little bit of a different job. So I'll go through those real quick, and I'm going to read off this so that I don't get it wrong. But there's one called the jail enforcement model, and that allows officers to question people in jail. This would typically be sheriff's deputies. Question people in jail, determine their immigration status, put their information into a Homeland Security database, and take statements and even begin the deportation process with an immigration detainer. The second kind of agreement is called a warrant service officer model, and that has a little bit of a narrower scope than the jail enforcement model I just explained. Those officers can identify people as non-citizens during the booking process in jail and refer them to ICE for evaluation and potentially deportation. And they can also serve an ICE administrative warrant for people in custody. And then the third kind is called a task force model. And that is essentially allowing police or sheriff's deputies to assume the duties of immigration officers out in the community while they're doing their normal, in the course of their normal duties.
Interesting. Okay. And as you're reporting on this, you traveled to Terrell County to visit the border and talk with that county sheriff. Tell us about what you learned on that trip.
Yeah, so we went out to Terrell County. We were invited, or we were allowed to ride along with the sheriff there. His name's Thaddeus Cleveland, or he goes by Thad, Sheriff Cleveland, and he's been the sheriff for a few years, I believe since 2022. It's an interesting place because Terrell County is very sparsely populated. Land-wise, it's about the size of Delaware, and it has like 800 people.
Oh,
and it's very rugged out there. It straddles the border with Mexico and the Rio Grande. And so it's a place where that sheriff has entered into a 287G agreement. It's also a place on the border where there has been migrants crossing illegally into the United States and sort of trekking across the land there, across some ranches, and then into the United States. And so it's a place where all of this kind of comes together. And he allowed us to go out there. He took us down to a ranch owned by a guy named Cody Carruthers, who also took us around on his ranch, and he has like sheep and goats out there. And he took us to some places where he showed us along his fence that some migrants had come through, cut part of his fence and climbed over. And so we saw all that. Sheriff Cleveland also drove us around the area, took us down to the Rio Grande River, and explained all the different things that he does. At one point, where there was even sort of an interaction between Sheriff Cleveland and some local people, and some confusion from them over how why they hadn't, they had called in previously to report migrants crossing through, and they said they hadn't gotten assistance. And that interaction sort of highlighted the it's not misinformation, but some confusion and unknowns between people and what's really going on the border. And they were saying that they had called the sheriff's office and never gotten, people out there. And then after some questioning, it turned out they had called before Sheriff Cleveland was ever actually the sheriff. He wasn't even in office at that time. And they were concerned about drugs being carried across. And he explained that, he was a Border Patrol agent for 20 years before and several years in that area. And he said that they had not had a drug seizure in 5 years in the area. So he sort of explained how that area of Texas, there are migrants crossing through, but they were not bringing any drugs.
And you mentioned Cody Carruthers, and you mentioned that he was showing you along his fence line and talking about some of the issues he's had where his fence has been cut. Let's go to that clip now.
What kind of challenges does it present for you when the fence does get broken or torn up?
I can lose my guard dogs, the goats can get out, and these animals can get in a lot easier. It takes an army to fix it like it was when it was brand new. And it's devastating to me, it's heartbreaking.
You also mentioned that interaction that Sheriff Thad was having with people who were really frustrated living in Terrell County. Let's go to that.
We haven't had a drug seizure in 5 years.
Well, what the hell are they, why?
Clothes, food.
What has drug seizure been like here?
I can look anybody in the eye and tell them that it's not crossing here.
So who are most of the people who are crossing in your county?
Out here, we typically catch accompanied juveniles. That means they're with their father, their brother, an uncle, something like that. But again, the vast majority are people no different than us that are coming north to work. But I've also apprehended those that do have criminal records. They're those that committed crimes in the United States, and of course, that's what this administration said they were going to target.
What I found so interesting about your reporting, David, was that we really got an idea of the sentiments of a couple of people that were living in this area. But your reporting also highlights these agreements are proliferating like never before. Can you explain what's happening?
Yeah, so there are lots of new agreements being signed. Under Biden, in the last 4 years before January, no new agreements were signed, and there were or renewed. And so to give you an idea of how many we have now, in 2020, according to the ICE data that they have online right now, there were 90 agreements signed or renewed that year. 4 years later, in the first 5.5 months of this year, there have been 420 agreements signed or renewed. And that is driven in large part by a couple states. As Florida has at least 250, and Texas has 85 as of mid-May, and the numbers are constantly changing because new agencies are signing up all the time.
Wow. Why are there so many new agreements?
So there's a few reasons. One, a lot of sheriffs and police departments just want to sign on and be part of this immigration effort that Trump, was a big part of Trump's election and being elected to the presidency. There's also some states like Florida and Georgia that have signed laws or created laws that require agencies in certain circumstances to sign these agreements or sign similar agreements that help with federal immigration efforts.
So you mentioned earlier that Florida and Texas, they're largely driving this increase in 287G agreements, but there's also a bill filed in the legislature to, it seems like, solidify this or make it a requirement for some areas. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Here in Texas, there's a bill by State Senator Charles Shortner. He's a Republican out of Georgetown, and his bill requires sheriff's departments and counties with more than 100,000 people to sign these agreements or try to get into one of the agreements, a 287G agreement. And his bill doesn't specify which kind, but it would set that requirement in law.
Okay. So a lot of sheriffs in Texas favor these 287G agreements. Are there criticisms of the program?
Yeah, there are criticisms of the program. One, I think, and there are even some sheriff's departments that have this concern, is that logistically, financially, to put a sheriff's deputy onto this type of assignment can be a strain on resources. So they have to go out and train. During that time, they're being paid, but they're not at their post. So someone needs to fill the post, and then there's a cost to it. We spoke with several experts that also had separate concerns. The ACLU published a report in 2022 that called this like a broken relic of the past that was racist, that had unproven results and was counterproductive. So their report was pretty harsh about it. We also spoke with an attorney and legal scholar who works at St. Mary's University in San Antonio. Her name's Annie Bright, and she raised concerns about how this could essentially effectively be done and protecting people's constitutional rights to due process. She also raised the concern of racial profiling and law enforcement identifying people because of the way they look. Another person we spoke to was a professor of criminology at University of California in Irvine, Charis Kubrin, and she is a scholar and studies the crossover between undocumented immigrants and crime. And so that's what she studies, and she's written a book about it. And what she looked at in the book and what she explained to us is that she said, I've looked at, all the studies, I've looked at the academic research, and she said there's not a link between undocumented people and a rise in crime or violent crime. And so she said the assumption that you need to enter into these agreements, she called it a devolution of law enforcement, sort of like devolving or pushing the enforcement of these laws from the federal government down to lower level, not state and local level law enforcement. She said it's a flawed assumption to us to say that you have to do that to stop violent crime.
Well, Matt, David, you both have been looking into one aspect of immigration enforcement that's been lacking for decades, and that's punishments for employers who hire undocumented workers. Tell us about what you found.
Well, Kelly, we wanted to look at the potential economic impact that these mass deportations could have, and we found that the federal government's use of enforcement efforts have largely focused on going after migrant workers rather than the bosses that hire and pay them. It is illegal in the United States to knowingly hire someone who isn't in the country legally. So we looked at some data from ICE and found that over the last 4 years, looking at labor exploitation cases, out of 3,115 cases total, there were only 84 management level indictments. And Democratic state lawmakers, at least one of them that we showed that we informed that we told about the data that we found, said this is an example of the federal government, going after the migrant workers, saying, to something to the effect of we don't see the CEOs being rounded up.
Okay. And David, I want to go to you for this question. I understand ICE got back to you on this, on y'all's story, and I'm curious what they had to say about your findings.
That's right. They did provide an email statement after our deadline, and they told us that they consider worksite enforcement a critical component of their immigration enforcement system. They said they use sort of a three-pronged approach: civil enforcement, criminal measures, and then also trying to educate the public and the business community. They also said that it does take, and they acknowledge it does take a substantial amount of evidence to reach the threshold of showing that an employer has knowingly employed unauthorized immigrants. They said here, and I'll read a little bit of their statement directly. Our goal is to protect American jobs deter employers from knowingly hiring unauthorized workers and to prevent associated criminal activities such as human trafficking, document fraud, and labor exploitation. So they sent us that, and it does acknowledge a couple parts of our reporting that Matt is explaining, that there's a high threshold to meet to be able to show that an employer has knowingly hired an unauthorized worker.
Very interesting. Well, I know immigration is typically a federal issue, but has the state tried to do anything to deter business owners from hiring undocumented workers?
Yeah, so Republican Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, back when he was a senator in 2009, so rewind a little bit, he filed a bill that would have given the state the authority to strip the business license of companies that knowingly hire undocumented workers. So doing that, paying them under the table to avoid paying state taxes and unemployment insurance. Patrick at the time painted this as a pro-business move, something that would level the playing field because companies, by hiring cheap labor, he said, had an unfair competitive advantage. And so this would take that away. The business community fought back against it, saying that immigration was something that the federal government should fix, that it shouldn't be on the state level, and that bill never made it out of committee. David and I had reached out to the lieutenant governor's office to ask for comment a couple of times. Why has this bill not been filed again? Does he think it should be? And we did not hear back.
And one thing you heard from people concerned about an immigration crackdown would be the impact on the Texas economy. What did they say about that?
Well, I spoke with Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller, and he says, look, the government's just going after criminals right now, and that so far this has not had an impact at all on the economy. It's certainly not on farming, which is what his office oversees. He attributes that mostly to new technology and automation, which he says has lessened the need to hire undocumented immigrants, something he admits he himself has done unknowingly in the past.
Do you think that the ongoing deportation efforts will have an impact on Texas's economy?
Well, we've been doing this since January, and so far they haven't had any impact. Right now, the main focus is getting rid of the bad guys. People still think of a farmer as bib overalls and a straw hat chewing on a piece of hay, but we're not that anymore. We're agriculture 3.0. We have cows that milk themselves by robotic milkers. We have autonomous tractors that drive themselves.
Now, on the flip side of the coin, critics of mass deportation efforts like the American Immigration Council, they worry that this will have a crushing effect on the economy. They point to estimates that there are 2 million undocumented immigrants living in Texas right now that make up 9% of the workforce, 17% of all agriculture jobs, about a quarter of all construction jobs. I spoke with one couple. They wouldn't share their immigration status, but they spoke to me about what it's like being in the cleaning and construction industry.
What's going to happen if everybody disappears? Nobody's going to clean your building. Nobody's going to clean your house.
Cosa que uno no hace, uno quiere.
The construction companies, they are going to broke because the most of the immigrants employees, they are the hard workers.
Are many of the construction workers that you are with, are they undocumented, most of them?
Yeah.
Now, there is a legal path, and the president touched on it a couple months into his second term and addressed the concerns about potential shortages in the workforce due to the ongoing deportations. It's a temporary visa. It's called H-2A or H-2B. The H-2A focuses on seasonal agriculture workers, and that's something that Commissioner Miller had talked to us about, that basically the government provides hundreds of thousands of these temporary visas that allow undocumented workers from foreign countries to stay in the country legally on a seasonal temporary basis based on the needs of their employers. And the president said that this is something that he wants to look into, and administration officials says they want to strengthen the program. And the president recently said, quote, we have to take care of our farmers, and specifically also mentioned hotel workers too, as a way to keep employees in the country legally on a temporary basis.
And your investigation started with looking at how this would impact the state financially, but is the state studying the financial impact of all of this?
The state has not studied this issue in almost 20 years. The last time this was looked at, the Texas Comptroller's Office did a study that was released in 2006, so back when President George W. Bush was in office. And at the time, the study looked at the effects of deportations and found that potentially deporting 1.4 million undocumented immigrants would cost the state about $17 billion in gross state product, with production costs rising, and the impact the report found would be felt for decades. The issue, though, has not been studied since.
Wow. Well, Matt, thank you so much for your reporting. David, thank you so much for your reporting. You can watch our full undocumented series online right now at KXAN.com. But for those of you listening or watching, we appreciate you. Don't forget to join us next Friday at 10:30 for Inside the Investigation. You can also listen to KXAN's Investigative podcast. We're highlighting all of this there. You can find it wherever you get podcasts. It's going to feature audio versions of our weekly Inside the Investigation conversation with the journalists working on those stories. Guys, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.